World War II gave us some of the greatest stories ever told on screen. But for every masterpiece, there's a disaster Hollywood would rather you forget. Some of these movies twisted history beyond recognition, while others drowned real heroism in cliches and melodrama. So, here's the question. When does a war epic stop honoring the past and start embarrassing itself? Stick around, because a few of these misfires are so bad, you'll wonder how they ever made it past the studio gates. Pearl Harbor, 2001. Few titles in movie history are as infamous as Pearl Harbor. With a massive budget, a talented cast, and the backdrop of one of America's most tragic events, it had every chance to become a definitive war drama. Instead, Michael Bay delivered something closer to a glossy soap opera with explosions. The attack on Pearl Harbor, one of the darkest days in U.S. history, was turned into the backdrop for a love triangle that felt like it belonged in a teen drama. Yes, the action sequences were visually impressive. The explosions roared, the planes soared, and the chaos of battle was staged with Bay's signature flair. But when the smoke cleared, what remained was a hollow story stuffed with cliches, clunky dialogue, and painfully shallow characters. Critics shredded the film for exploiting history rather than honoring it. Even audiences who love blockbusters left theaters feeling like they'd been sold spectacle instead of substance. The most frustrating part? The real story of Pearl Harbor didn't need Hollywood embellishment. Thousands of lives were lost, families were shattered, and the world was changed forever. Reducing that to a backdrop for a generic romance was more than bad taste. It was cinematic malpractice. Pearl Harbor isn't just a bad World War II movie. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when Hollywood values style over sincerity. U57-1-2000. If you want a textbook example of Hollywood rewriting history, look no further than U571. The film tells the story of American sailors capturing a German Enigma machine, a brilliant code device used by the Nazis. There's just one problem. It never happened. In reality, it was the British Royal Navy that pulled off that daring operation, at great cost and bravery. But in the world of Hollywood, history was bent to give the Americans all the credit. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Historians, veterans, and even then British Prime Minister Tony Blair condemned the movie for its blatant inaccuracies. While the filmmakers tried to argue it was just fiction, that excuse rang hollow for those who lived through the war. When you're depicting real battles and real sacrifices, accuracy matters. And beyond the historical controversy, the movie itself wasn't exactly a gem. The action sequences were decent, but the characters felt paper-thin, and the story quickly slipped into standard submarine cliches. It tried to balance tension and spectacle, but ended up pleasing no one. The Enigma story is one of the most fascinating tales of World War II, and instead of celebrating the truth, U571 turned it into a shallow, patriotic fantasy. The result? A movie remembered less for its thrills and more for insulting the very people it claimed to honor. Sometimes, a war film can be bad. But when it's bad and disrespectful, that's when it sinks to the bottom. Windtalkers, 2002. The Navajo Code Talkers were heroes. Their unbreakable code saved countless lives and helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. Their story deserved a powerful, heartfelt film. What they got was Windtalkers, a Nicolas Cage action vehicle that sidelined the very people it was supposed to celebrate. Directed by John Woo, the film was marketed as a tribute, but what ended up on screen was a noisy, cliché-filled spectacle. Instead of focusing on the Navajo Marines, the spotlight fell on Cage's troubled white sergeant, whose mission was to protect a code talker at all costs, even if that meant silencing him to keep the code safe. This bodyguard framing pushed the actual Navajo characters to the sidelines of their own story, reducing them to supporting roles. It was Hollywood's old habit of filtering minority heroism through a white savior lens, and audiences noticed. The film tried to compensate with explosive battle scenes and Wu's trademark action style. But even those felt over the top and disconnected from the grounded reality of war. The dialogue was stiff, the characters underdeveloped, and the emotional weight that should have carried the film never landed. For many, Windtalkers wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was an insult. A story of innovation, bravery, and cultural significance was turned into a generic war movie that could have been about anyone, anywhere. The Navajo deserved better. Audiences deserved better. And Hollywood should have known better. Red Tails 2012. George Lucas poured his heart and fortune into Red Tails, determined to give the Tuskegee Airmen, the first African-American fighter pilots in World War II, the recognition they deserved. The idea was noble. The execution? Not so much. Instead of a gritty, inspiring war drama, audiences got a cartoonish, clunky movie that looked and sounded like it was written for Saturday morning TV. The visual effects were solid, especially the aerial combat sequences. Planes zipped through the skies in crisp digital battles. But every time the characters opened their mouths, the illusion collapsed. The dialogue was painfully corny, riddled with outdated stereotypes and overblown heroics that made even the most serious moments feel laughable. The pilots, who should have been portrayed as layered, complex men breaking barriers, often came across as one-note caricatures. Critics wanted to like it. Audiences wanted to like it. But no amount of goodwill could disguise the fact that the script lacked depth, nuance, or authenticity. Even with Lucas's passion project energy, Red Tails ended up looking like a video game cutscene stretched into 2 hours. What hurts most is that the Tuskegee Airmen's story still deserves the definitive film it never got. Red Tails had the chance to be that film. Instead, it became an awkward, hollow misfire remembered for wasting an opportunity that could have been historic. The Battle of the Bulge, 1965. On paper, the Battle of the Bulge should have been an instant classic. An all-star cast, a massive budget, and one of the most famous battles of World War II as its subject. But what audiences got was a bloated, historically inaccurate mess that enraged veterans and disappointed viewers worldwide. The problem started with the basics. Tanks that looked nothing like the ones used in World War II, unrealistic tactics, and an oversimplified narrative that turned a complex, brutal battle into something resembling a game of checkers. Real veterans who fought in the Ardennes couldn't believe what they were watching. Even Dwight D. Eisenhower, who led Allied forces in Europe, condemned the film for distorting history so badly. And beyond the inaccuracies, the movie just wasn't good. It dragged on with uneven pacing. The characters were flat, and the big battle sequences felt more like staged reenactments than raw depictions of combat. It was a classic example of Hollywood thinking bigger automatically meant better. Spoiler: it didn't. Instead of honoring one of the most desperate and hard-fought clashes of the war, the Battle of the Bulge turned into an expensive embarrassment. It stands today as a reminder that authenticity, respect, and storytelling matter more than spectacle. Without those, even the biggest war epic crumbles under its own weight. Midway, 2019. Roland Emmerich is famous for destroying landmarks in movies like Independence Day and The Day After Tomorrow. But when he turned his attention to World War II with Midway, audiences quickly learned that disaster on screen isn't always thrilling. It can just be disastrous. The Battle of Midway is one of the most important clashes in the Pacific Theater, where outnumbered American forces stunned the Japanese Navy and turned the tide of the war. That story alone should carry a film. Instead, Midway buried it under video game-style CGI and dialogue that sounded like it had been pulled from a high school play. Characters spouted lines so wooden you could practically build a ship out of them, and no amount of digital explosions could disguise the lack of humanity. The cast included big names like Woody Harrelson, Dennis Quaid, and Patrick Wilson, but even their talent couldn't elevate a script so thin it barely held together. The problem wasn't just the flashy visuals. It was that the movie treated history like background scenery. It had the spectacle of a fireworks show, but none of the emotional weight that makes a war story matter. In the end, Midway felt like déjà vu after Pearl Harbor, proving that Hollywood still hadn't learned its lesson. Audiences want stories about people, not just pixels. Instead of a tribute to courage, it was another hollow spectacle, and one that veterans and history buffs found especially insulting. The Thin Red Line, 1998. When Terrence Malick makes a film, you know it's going to be unconventional. But with The Thin Red Line, his meditative style split audiences right down the middle. Some critics praised it as poetic art. Many others saw it as one of the most pretentious war films ever put on screen. Set during the Battle of Guadalcanal, the film follows a group of soldiers as they navigate the horrors of jungle combat. But instead of focusing on tension, strategy, or even character arcs, Malick drenched the movie in whispered narration, philosophical musings, and endless shots of swaying grass. It often felt less like a war film and more like a 3-hour nature documentary with occasional gunfire. To be fair, the cinematography was gorgeous, and the star-studded cast included Sean Penn, Nick Nolte, and George Clooney. But their performances were buried under Malick's obsession with mood and imagery. The pacing was glacial, and scenes dragged on long after they had made their point. Released the same year as Saving Private Ryan, The Thin Red Line suffered even more by comparison. Where Spielberg's film was raw, gripping, and immediate, Malick's felt detached, floaty, and self-indulgent. It wasn't just slow, it was almost inaccessible to mainstream audiences. For some, it's a misunderstood masterpiece. For most, it's proof that a war film can drown in its own ambition. The Thin Red Line promised insight into the human condition, but delivered an art project disguised as a war movie. Objective, Burma, 1945. Errol Flynn was Hollywood's golden boy, known for swashbuckling charm and charisma. But when he starred in Objective, Burma, at the tail end of the war, the movie became infamous, not for his performance, but for its brazen rewriting of history. The film tells the story of American paratroopers fighting Japanese forces in the Burmese jungle. Sounds fine, right? Except in reality, the actual Burma campaign was fought almost entirely by British, Indian, and Commonwealth troops. The Americans played only a small part. By giving all the credit to Flynn's fictional squad, Hollywood essentially erased the sacrifices of thousands of real soldiers. The reaction in Britain was explosive. Veterans who had bled in the jungles were furious, and the government itself condemned the film. It was banned outright in the UK for years. Even US audiences found the narrative far-fetched, and critics noted the movie stretched believability to the breaking point. To make matters worse, the script leaned on simplistic portrayals and shallow dialogue, turning what could have been an intense survival story into a drawn-out exercise in propaganda. The action sequences lacked bite, and Flynn, though still charming, felt out of place in a gritty war setting. Objective, Burma is now remembered less as an adventure film and more as a symbol of Hollywood arrogance. Changing small details for drama is one thing. Rewriting an entire war to boost box office appeal? That's the kind of move that earns a permanent spot on the shame list. Enemy at the Gates, 2001. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the bloodiest and most pivotal confrontations of World War II. It was hell on earth, a brutal clash that changed the course of history. So when Hollywood decided to turn it into a sniper duel love triangle, you can imagine the disappointment. Enemy at the Gates centers on a duel between Soviet sniper Vasily Zaitsev, played by Jude Law, and a German counterpart. On paper, that setup has all the ingredients for a tense, gripping war thriller. In execution, it was uneven at best. The biggest problem? The film couldn't decide what it wanted to be. One moment, it was a gritty survival drama. The next, it was a clumsy romance that felt forced and out of place. The accents didn't help either. Almost every actor, from Jude Law to Rachel Weisz to Bob Hoskins, spoke in their own awkward approximation of a Russian accent, which pulled audiences right out of the story. Add in some questionable historical liberties, and what should have been an edge-of-your-seat war film turned into something unintentionally laughable. To its credit, a few scenes captured the chaos of Stalingrad effectively, but those glimpses of greatness were buried under a script that felt more like Hollywood trying to imitate a war movie than actually delivering one. The result was a film that looked serious on the surface, but collapsed under the weight of its own cliches. Instead of honoring the brutal reality of Stalingrad, Enemy at the Gates turned it into a soap opera with rifles. Hart's War, 2002. Prisoner of war films can be some of the most powerful war dramas, when done right. Hart's War, unfortunately, did almost everything wrong. Starring Bruce Willis and Colin Farrell, the movie set out to tell a gripping story of morality, sacrifice, and survival inside a German POW camp. But instead of tension, audiences got a muddled courtroom drama disguised as a war movie. The premise had potential. Farrell plays a young law student turned soldier who ends up defending a fellow prisoner accused of murder. It could have been a compelling story about justice under impossible conditions. But the execution was painfully slow, the dialogue wooden, and the suspense non-existent. Scenes that should have been loaded with emotion felt flat, and even Willis, usually reliable, seemed to be going through the motions. The real crime, though, was how the movie wasted its setting. A POW camp is ripe for storytelling, desperation, escape attempts, the constant fight for dignity and survival. Instead of leaning into that, Hart's War got bogged down in endless trial scenes that dragged the pacing into the mud. By the time the film reached its climax, audiences had already checked out. Critics were merciless, calling it dull, predictable, and uninspired. Even fans of courtroom dramas felt it was poorly handled. In trying to mix two genres, war epic and legal thriller, the film ended up doing justice to neither. Hart's War could have been a tense, emotional World War II drama. Instead, it was a forgettable slog that left viewers wishing they'd spent 2 hours on literally anything else. Anzio, 1968. With Robert Mitchum and Peter Falk leading the cast, Anzio should have been an unforgettable war epic. Instead, it became one of the dullest and most uninspired World War II movies ever released. The Battle of Anzio was a grueling campaign, defined by brutal fighting and tactical blunders that kept Allied soldiers pinned down far longer than expected. That kind of tension should have made for gripping cinema, but on screen, it played out like a flat, meandering lecture. The film couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Was it an anti-war critique? A straightforward combat story? A character drama? The result was a confused mix that satisfied nobody. The pacing dragged, dialogue felt lifeless, and even the action scenes, supposedly the highlight, were staged without energy. Viewers expecting tense battles instead got long stretches of nothing, broken up by uninspired firefights. The biggest failure, though, was how Anzio handled its characters. Mitchum's war correspondent seemed detached from everything happening around him, while the supporting soldiers felt like stock types recycled from better movies. Instead of pulling audiences into the chaos of Italy, the film kept them at arm's length. Critics at the time blasted Anzio as boring and misguided, and today it's remembered as an example of wasted potential. With its strong cast and subject matter, it could have been a standout war film. Instead, it became another bloated entry in the long list of Hollywood's WWII misfires. Attack, 1956. At first glance, Attack looked like it might be one of those daring mid-century films that challenged the traditional, heroic war movie template. Directed by Robert Aldrich, it aimed to show cowardice and corruption in the officer ranks. Bold idea, right? Unfortunately, the execution was clumsy, and what could have been groundbreaking ended up as a heavy-handed, awkward misfire. The story follows a group of infantrymen under the command of an incompetent officer whose poor decisions cost lives. On paper, this is compelling material. Highlighting the flaws in military leadership could have sparked serious discussion. But instead of nuance, the film hammered its point with such force that it lost credibility. The characters came off as caricatures. The dialogue was theatrical rather than authentic, and the attempts at moral complexity felt stagey rather than powerful. Some audiences appreciated the attempt at realism, but many found it frustrating. Instead of portraying the gray areas of war, the movie painted everything in black and white. Soldiers weren't people, they were symbols. Officers weren't flawed humans, they were villains. And by pushing so hard, the film undercut its own message. The result? Attack is remembered less as a courageous critique and more as a case study in how not to balance message with storytelling. It tried to be provocative, but ended up shallow, proving that bold ideas mean nothing if the execution falls flat. To End All Wars, 2001. World War II. Prisoner of war films have a long tradition of gripping stories about survival and resilience. To End All Wars, starring Kiefer Sutherland and Robert Carlyle, should have carried that torch. Instead, it stumbled badly, delivering a disjointed, preachy narrative that left audiences cold. Set in a Japanese prison camp in Burma, the film follows Allied prisoners forced to build a railway under brutal conditions. That real story is harrowing and deserves respect. But the movie's clumsy storytelling undermined its power. The pacing lurched awkwardly, jumping between violence and forced moral lessons. The characters, rather than feeling like real people, were reduced to mouthpieces for simplistic ideas. The film leaned so heavily on its themes that it forgot to develop tension. Scenes dragged, emotions felt unearned, and by the end, it seemed less like a visceral survival tale and more like a lecture. Critics complained that the movie smothered drama under sentimentality, and even viewers sympathetic to its message found it hard to stay engaged. What makes it frustrating is the potential. The true story behind To End All Wars had everything: danger, sacrifice, and endurance in the face of unimaginable suffering. But instead of honoring that, the film got lost in clunky dialogue and uneven execution. Audiences left theaters not inspired, but disappointed. Operation Pacific, 1951. John Wayne's name on a poster usually guaranteed thrills. But Operation Pacific is one of the rare cases where even the Duke couldn't save a sinking ship. Set on a submarine during the war in the Pacific, the movie promised suspense and high-seas drama. What it delivered was a bland, forgettable story, padded with clichés and predictable romance. Instead of capturing the claustrophobic tension of submarine warfare, the film glossed over the reality and settled for surface-level drama. The battle sequences lacked bite, the stakes never felt urgent, and the romantic subplot seemed jammed in just to keep audiences distracted from how little was happening. Worse still, veterans criticized the movie for its lack of authenticity. Submarine crews faced constant danger, mechanical failures, and harrowing choices, none of which were convincingly shown here. Instead, Operation Pacific felt sanitized, more interested in John Wayne's star power than in showing the truth of naval combat. Audiences expecting intensity were left bored, and critics dismissed it as one of Wayne's weaker efforts. Today, it survives mostly as a footnote in his career, a reminder that even Hollywood icons can't carry a weak script and uninspired direction. The Last Drop, 2006. If you've never heard of The Last Drop, there's a reason. This straight-to-video clunker tried to combine war drama with a heist plot, and the result was a disaster. Starring Billy Zane and Michael Madsen, the film follows a ragtag group of Allied soldiers sent behind enemy lines during Operation Market Garden. Sounds exciting, right? Sadly, the execution was pure chaos. The production looked cheap from the first frame. Sets felt flimsy, costumes looked like rentals, and the dialogue was so stiff it could have been written by a computer. The supposed heist angle was confusing and poorly explained, leaving audiences unsure if they were watching a war movie, a caper, or a parody. Even the battle scenes lacked energy. Filmed with such low production value they bordered on embarrassing. The cast, despite having recognizable faces, seemed just as lost as the audience. Performances were flat, pacing was uneven, and the story never built momentum. Instead of a thrilling adventure, viewers were left with a jumble of half-baked ideas that collapsed under their own weight. Critics barely bothered with it, and those who did were merciless. For many, The Last Drop represents the bottom of the barrel for WWII movies, a film so confused, so poorly executed, and so forgettable that it feels like a parody of itself. And there you have it, 15 WWII films that Hollywood should hang its head over. Some fumbled history, some drowned in cliches, and some were just plain boring. Together, they prove that even with the greatest story material in human history, bad filmmaking still finds a way. Which one do you think deserves the crown as the worst of the worst? Drop your thoughts below, hit that subscribe button, and share this with a friend who loves movies. Because sometimes, the failures are just as fascinating as the masterpieces.